I still can't shake the feeling that that day was the last day of my old life. The moment I opened the door and saw them, it was like my heart stopped. She was my wife and he was the one person I didn't know about, but always felt his presence. I just couldn't believe that at that exact moment, everything I had been building came crashing down. My hands were shaking and I stood in the hallway, terror in my eyes, but I couldn't leave. I couldn't turn around and just walk away because my whole life, all my feelings, everything I was, it all changed in an instant. I knew coming home wasn't going to be easy. But I didn't think this reality would catch up with me. It wasn't just a casual glance. It wasn't just a simple revelation. It was a revelation, like a heavy blow to the head, like the final nail in the coffin lid. I felt as if all the years I had spent married had turned out to be a lie. A lie that I had willingly played a part in, but what happened next was even more painful. I didn't just witness the betrayal, I became a part of it. That day started out like any other day. I woke up, as usual, at 7 a.m. My eyes weren't clear yet, but it felt like I was expecting something. Katia and I hadn't been the same for a long time. Our conversations had become infrequent, and her gaze had turned more and more to somewhere in the distance, as if she was searching for something I couldn't give her. I didn't know what exactly it was. Fatigue? Problems at work? Or something else? I used to think that everything was fixable, but something inside me had been telling me for a long time that this day was not going to be ordinary. I went to work as usual, and Katia stayed home. Her behavior had changed over the last few months, less smiling. More silent. Sometimes I thought she couldn't hear me, that I had become a stranger to her. I tried to ignore these thoughts, immersing myself in the daily routine. After all, it was easier that way, but, as always happens, there comes a moment when all the things you've been trying to ignore start to come out. And that moment came. Coming home that day was fateful for me. When I opened the door and entered the apartment, I was overcome with a strange sense of unease. Something was not right. At first I couldn't figure out what exactly this strangeness was. Everything was quiet. I was used to there always being some kind of noise at home, music, TV, or at least sounds in the kitchen. But now there was an oppressive silence. I knew Katia had to be home. She had no plans for the evening. But she wasn't in the apartment either. I walked down the hallway, hung up my jacket, and headed into the living room. And that's when I heard them, the laughter. It was a light, insincere laugh that alerted me at once. It was too loud, too loose. I stopped in place, listening. Yes, it was familiar. That laugh, I had heard it before. It was the laugh of a man. A man I didn't know. And it was strange. Katia was always quiet when she was home alone. She never laughed so openly. Everything inside me twitched, and I felt my whole body fill with cold. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to just turn around and walk away, but some inner voice pushed me on. I followed the sound, carefully, almost on tiptoe, trying not to make too much noise. When I reached the bedroom door, it became clear to me what was happening. I couldn't believe my eyes. She was with him. With him. With this man I had never seen, but had always felt. He was by her side and they weren't just close, they were in love. He was holding her hand, pulling her close to him, and I could see her responding to him with the same look she had once looked at me with. I knew her look. It was the same one she had once given me when we first started dating. That look that said, "You are my world," but now she was looking at it the same way. At that moment, something inside me broke. I stood there like a stumbling block, not knowing what to do. I could feel the air squeezing my chest, my heart starting to beat too fast, and my thoughts jumbling in my head. I tried to squeeze a word out of myself, but it wouldn't come out. It was too much. Everything was too much. The man turned first. He clearly wasn't ready for me to walk in. He froze for a moment, but then quickly stood up and backed away. I realized he was trying to escape as soon as he spotted me. But I still couldn't believe what was happening. I couldn't believe that this scene had become a reality. And that's when I saw her eyes. She saw me too. And her gaze was full of fear. But not just fear. I saw something else in her eyes: guilt. Regret. And maybe even relief. I didn't know what to say. I stood there, as if I were restrained. Every word was hard to say. How could you, Katya? She didn't answer. She just stood up and tried to approach me, but I stepped back, as if I sensed that there was an abyss between us that could not be crossed. It's not what you think. Her voice was shaky, but she quickly pulled herself together. It isn't, but I didn't believe her. I couldn't. It couldn't be wrong. It was all too obvious, too obvious. This man was real, and her feelings were real too. He was the one she wanted, and I was the one who was a thing of the past. I tried to gather my thoughts, but all I felt was disappointment and betrayal. It was more than pain. It was an emptiness that filled me whole. Who is he? I asked, trying to keep a calm tone, but I could feel my body shaking. She was silent, and it was clear to me that there was no way to answer that question. The answer was too simple: he was her lover. When the man left, I stood alone in the kitchen, watching her as she was about to say something, as she wanted to explain. But the words I expected didn't come. Nothing had been said. Her whole life, her whole truth remained hidden. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't stay in this. Katya stood in front of me, her eyes darting between me and the emptiness, as if she was searching for words that could make it all less painful. But I knew words couldn't change anything. All I saw was what she had betrayed me with. I could no longer look at her as the woman I loved, trusted, built a future with. I can't understand this, I said, almost breaking down into a scream. You promised you'd always be honest. You said you'd be with me, that we'd be happy. Her face contorted in pain. She tried to say something, but her voice was weak, trailing off, as if the words couldn't get past her throat. I wasn't honest, she said, and I felt her voice shake with tears. But I didn't want this to happen. I didn't want it to happen. I exhaled, clenching my fists, not knowing how to react. I wanted to scream, I wanted to walk away and never see her again. But something held me back. Something wouldn't let me leave. I knew I had to do something. But what? I couldn't let myself break the bond, even if it was broken. You don't want to do that? Do you really think I, your husband, need to worry about your feelings? I couldn't hide my rage anymore. You could at least be honest with me instead of hiding behind empty words and looks. She took a step back, as if my words had hit her. I could see her shoulders slumping, trying to hold back the tears, but it wasn't working. We both stood in this strange, heavy silence. As if time had stopped. You don't understand, she whispered. I don't know how it happened. I tried, I really tried. But you and I were so far apart. You've changed, and so have I. We drifted apart, and I was looking for someone who would understand me. Her words tore at my heart. Like it was my fault she was looking for comfort elsewhere. I didn't want to hear her excuses. I didn't want to hear her trying to justify her betrayal. Were you looking for him? Were you looking for another man? Did you forget about me so easily? My words, like jabs, were hitting the target. I no longer felt the strength to hold back my emotions. She tilted her head, but I could see her lips trembling. She couldn't meet my gaze, and I realized she understood that all her attempts to apologize now looked pathetic. I didn't mean for things to turn out this way, she said, but there was no strength in her voice. It sounded like a pathetic attempt to explain the impossible. It was so hard for me, Sasha, you have no idea how hard it was for me. I stood up, taking a few steps back, trying to calm myself down. My brain was telling me that I shouldn't react so harshly, that I should be above it all. But I couldn't. I couldn't be rational when everything was crumbling in front of me. Is it hard? I turned and looked at her with a look that could probably kill. Difficult, you say? It's not you who should say it's hard for you, it's me, because my life is a lie, it's a betrayal. The words I spoke were not only accusations, but echoes of my own anguish. I wasn't just hurt. I was broken. My wife, with whom I had built a life, turned out to be different than I knew her to be. I didn't know what to do now. I've said more to myself than to her. I don't know how I'm supposed to go on living if everything I believed in turned out to be a lie. She stepped towards me, trying to take my hand, but I pulled away, unable to bear her touch. I didn't want to feel her closeness anymore. It hurt, and I was willing to do anything to get rid of that pain, even if it meant I had to let her go forever. You don't understand, she said again, her voice barely audible. I don't. I still love you. But you love him, I interrupted, my words sounding cold and detached. So what now? Do you want me to forgive you? To go back to the way things were before? She covered her face with her hands, her body trembling. I could see her struggling with herself, trying to find a single reason to justify her actions. But I already knew there were no excuses. I can't accept it, Katia. I can't go on living with a man who betrayed me. I can't be with you anymore. My words sounded firm, even though there were many doubts inside me. But I knew it was the only way. In her eyes I saw confusion, pain and fear. She realized that she couldn't take anything back. And that was the scariest moment for both of us. Do you want me to leave? Her voice was almost invisible. I don't want you to leave, I said, though inwardly I felt that every moment, every look, every gesture made me feel the last door closing. But I can't stay with you. You've ruined everything. You've ruined us. The silence lasted a long time. We stood in front of each other, not knowing what to do next. There was no turning back, no clear future in our lives. I turned around and walked towards the door. No looking back. No regrets. I couldn't believe this was really happening. With every second, every step I took as I left the apartment, it was as if my heart was getting colder and colder. My head was full of thoughts, but they were vague, blurry. It had all happened so suddenly that I didn't even know how to deal with it. As I drove out of the house, I pulled into the nearest parking lot and sat in my car for a few minutes, not knowing what to do. My body was like an empty vessel, empty. Heavy as a rock, unable to move. I didn't know where to go, how to be, how to move on. Everything up to that moment seemed unimportant. All these years, all our plans, our conversations, our laughter, it became meaningless. In an instant, I lost everything. There was only one word in my head: betrayal. It sounded like a sentence. Finally, I started the car and drove off. I didn't know where I was going, just driving to distract myself, to calm my storm inside. I didn't even notice how I ended up on the outskirts of the city, in a neighborhood I had long forgotten. Time stretched on like an eternity, but one thought never left me: how could she? How could Katia, who was a part of my life, so easily destroy everything we had built? She said she loved me. She said I was her world. And now it was all a lie. It was unbearable. Flashbacks started popping up in my head, those moments when I was sure she and I were happy. How often I'd asked her to tell me if something was wrong. And each time she would reply that everything was fine, that she loved me. I felt that something was wrong, but I couldn't find an explanation. Now I realized that she was always hiding the truth, not giving me the slightest chance to know her feelings, her secrets. I stopped in the park and turned off the car. The outside world, the green trees, the children playing on the playground, seemed so distant, so foreign to me. I was lost in the world. Everything I knew and loved seemed so ridiculous, so inconsequential. Then my friend Igor called me. We hadn't talked to him for a long time, but at times like this, I knew that he was the kind of person who wouldn't turn away, wouldn't leave. He was always there for me, even if we hadn't seen each other for years. "Sasha, are you okay?" His voice was wary. I heard something was wrong. You're not answering your cell phone." I was sitting in the car, and that simple phrase, spoken in his familiar voice, felt like it shattered the last of my defenses. I couldn't hold back the tears. She cheated on me, Igor, I breathed out, trying not to break down into sobs. I came home, and she was, with him. He was in our apartment, in our bed. I witnessed her cheating on me, my heart was racing again, and I could hardly catch my breath. Igor was silent on the other end of the line for a long time. Are you okay? Finally, he asked. No, Igor, I'm not okay. I don't even know how I can go on living. I don't understand how she could do this. We were happy, weren't we, Sasha? Listen to me, his voice got harder. You have to do more than just deal with her. You have to deal with yourself. You can't afford to be weak. You deserve better than this. Those words hit me. It was as if Igor, who had always been there for me in my hardest moments, reminded me of who I was. I wasn't the kind of person who could afford to be defeated by betrayal. I was strong. I was a person who overcomes everything. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to collect myself. He was right. I couldn't stay in this quagmire. I couldn't allow myself to give up. Thank you, Igor. I'll call you back later, I said, trying to regain control. He said something else, but I couldn't hear anymore. His words started playing in my head again. You can't afford to be weak. I got into the car and, not knowing where I was going, started to move forward. But I knew one thing, I had to get out of this hell. I couldn't stay in this place where I was just a shadow of who I was. When I got home, Katia was there. She was standing in the kitchen, staring out the window. Everything around her seemed strange, alien. I felt like an outsider in my own home. She turned to me, but I saw no apology or regret in her gaze. It wasn't what I expected. It was empty. You're back. Her voice was quiet, almost unintelligible. I remained silent. Sasha, I don't know what to do. I realize I betrayed you, and I'm ashamed. I never meant for this to happen, she said with such sincerity that I found it hard to listen to her. I wanted to hear something else, something more meaningful. But none of that happened. Do you realize that you ruined everything? You didn't just betray me, you ruined us. Everything I thought we were, you and me, it was all a lie. She tried to approach me again, but I pulled back, as if afraid of her touch. You broke me, Katia. You don't deserve me. And I can't be with you anymore. With those words, I turned around and walked out of the apartment. Everything in front of me seemed like an illusion now. I didn't know where to go, but I walked down the street as if each step was an attempt to get rid of what I had experienced. My thoughts were disorderly, like streams of water in a river, rolling violently but not leading to any conclusion. I felt like I needed to be alone, to try to come to my senses, but I didn't know how to do it. Everything was burning inside me, and I couldn't stop that fire. Dusk had fallen, and I kept wandering around the city, ignoring the hour. The whole world was alien, not as I had known it before. The street I was walking down was quiet, almost empty, and only the echoes of my footsteps echoed in the silence. I stopped at the old cafe where Katia and I often sat after work, where we planned our future. It all seemed so distant now, so fake, like a picture from a foreign movie. I saw a couple sitting at a table by the window, holding hands, laughing and discussing something. These moments, which I had once perceived as ordinary, now caused me only pain. My fingers clenched into a fist and my heart raced. I remembered how Katia and I had sat there too, laughing and making plans for the future. Now all of that was ruined. I had to go somewhere, so I decided to go home, though the images of our last conversation flashed through my mind again. I struggled to open the door and enter the apartment, but the whole place felt foreign, as if I had returned to a place where I was no longer there. I was no longer the person who had once paced this apartment with the confidence that everything would be okay. The whole world was suddenly gray and cold. Katia was still sitting on the couch. She hadn't left as I had expected. Her eyes were red from crying and her expression resembled hopelessness. I felt her presence become heavy, as if she was physically pressing down on me. But I couldn't forgive her. I couldn't forget what she had done. And perhaps worst of all, I didn't know what to do about it. You left, and I. She looked up, her voice low and full of despair. You said you couldn't be with me, that I ruined everything. You're right. I have ruined us. Her words didn't penetrate me. They seemed as empty as her gaze. I felt every cell in my body resist even looking at her. And yet, despite my inner resistance, I responded. You think you can fix everything with words? Do you think your apology can change anything? I surprised myself at the cruelty of my words, but I couldn't stop. It was stronger than me. Katia was silent, she didn't try to justify herself. Maybe she realized that there were no excuses. Maybe she knew that her words meant nothing now. I felt something inside me break, as if I was becoming part of this crumbling life myself. But I couldn't go back. I couldn't forget. I don't know how I can go on. She spoke again, but her voice was quieter. I've lost everything. And I lost you. You were everything to me. I wanted to say something harsh, something that would finally end this agonizing silence. But I couldn't. I just stood in front of her as if I were a stranger. And maybe I really was a stranger, to her and to myself. I couldn't go back to that world where I trusted her, where I believed in us. You say you've lost me. My words sounded cold as a knife, but you haven't lost me, Katia. You lost everything we built. You chose him, you chose the lie. And I can't be with the man who destroyed everything we had. With each word, I felt my inner world grow empty and cold. I didn't know what would happen next, I didn't know how I would live my life, but I knew for sure I wouldn't be with her. I couldn't. It was impossible. I turned and headed for the exit. My steps were firm. But inside I was screaming. I was leaving, but I didn't know where. I just knew I couldn't stay. When I stepped outside, night had already fallen over the city, but I didn't care. I didn't feel cold or tired or hungry. It had all become empty, meaningless. All that was left was emptiness. I looked around, but saw nothing to hold me. Everything that had come before had vanished like smoke. As if I had never existed, I walked through the night streets, not thinking about direction, just walking away from what was left behind. Every street, every turn seemed foreign to me, as if I was in another city, another world. My mind was clouded, and every memory of Katia's betrayal was like a knife digging deeper and deeper into my soul. I tried to suppress these feelings, but they wouldn't let go. My feet led me along the sidewalks, and it seemed that the world around me had become somehow not real. I couldn't understand how everything had changed so quickly. Yesterday, everything was the way I was used to. We sat around the table, discussing plans for the future, laughing, talking about our dreams. And today? Today I was a man whose dreams had been shattered, whose life had ceased to have meaning. I didn't even know what to do with this pain. This grief. I walked into the small park that was nearby. It was dark all around, and only sparse lanterns illuminated the paths. This place was familiar to me. Katia and I often walked here, sitting on benches, talking about what we cared about. We watched the leaves fall from the trees, and the wind brought the smells of fall. But right now, it was all foreign. Just like everything else. I sat on the bench, unsure of what to do, and tried to gather my thoughts again. Questions swarmed in my head that I couldn't stop. Why? Why did she do this? What was she missing? Why hadn't I noticed it before? And each new question only deepened my despair. That's when I got the call. I looked at the screen and saw that it was Igor. I didn't want to talk to him, but I couldn't ignore his call. When I answered, I heard his calm but insistent voice. Sasha, where are you? I'm worried about you. You're not answering. I can't talk now, Igor. I held back the tears that seemed about to burst out. I need time. I need to be alone. You realize that's not the best thing to do, Igor said, his voice softer. You're not alone. We're with you, remember. You can trust me. I knew Igor was worried, and his words sounded sincere, but I wasn't ready to talk right now. I wasn't ready to open up to anyone. I wanted to be alone. Just to be. I can't talk right now, Igor. I'm sorry. I disconnected my phone, feeling the emptiness around me intensify. I knew my friends were worried about me, but right now it didn't matter. I was lost. All I had to do was keep walking, not knowing where to go. I got up from the bench and continued on my way through the park, oblivious to time, oblivious to my surroundings. Only one thought remained in my mind: how will I live on? How will I survive this moment, this pain, this traitorous wound that was inflicted on me? I headed toward the exit of the park and noticed the light in the window of an old house in the distance. It was the same house where I grew up, where there were many memories that once seemed important. My parents, old friends, everything was connected to this place. And now, as I walked by, I felt like it was the only place that could give me any sense of stability. A place where I had once been happy. I walked up to the house, climbed the steps and knocked on the door. After a few seconds, it opened. It was my mother. Seeing me, she instantly realized that something was wrong. I couldn't hide my emotions and her look was full of anxiety. "Son, what's wrong?" Her voice was soft but determined. "You don't look well." I walked silently into the house and closed the door behind me. My mom didn't ask any questions, she just came to me, hugged me, and said quietly, "You are here, and that's the main thing. You are not alone, Sasha." In that moment, I felt some balance finally returning. It was strange, a sense of coziness that I hadn't felt in a long time, like a small spark of warmth in a cold, shattered world. But that feeling was short-lived, and it couldn't completely overshadow the pain. I told my mother what had happened, though every word was hard for me to say. As I told her about Katia's betrayal, I realized that this was the end. It was the end of the life I had lived until now. And despite all her care, her words of comfort, I knew I had to move on. How and where? That was a question to which I had no answer. Mom didn't say much, she just listened and suggested I stay. I didn't know what I needed to do, I didn't know what I should do at all. But I realized that I needed time to sort myself out. I stayed the night at my mother's house. Dark thoughts, longing and pain wouldn't let me go, but I knew that for a while at least, I had found refuge. Time passed. And I stayed in that house, where I had once been a child, where I had everything: happiness, safety, care. But even that couldn't overshadow the dark emptiness that remained in my heart. A few days passed. I stayed with my mother, but every morning I woke up with the feeling that everything was not as it should be. The world around me was changed. Every morning I was faced with the fact that I couldn't go back to my old life. Katia, her betrayal, it all stayed with me like a heavy weight that wouldn't let go. And no matter how much time passed, this heavy stone on my soul did not disappear. My mother tried to make me feel comfortable. She tried to dispel the fog in my head, offering evening walks. Talking about all sorts of nonsense, about how her day went. But her efforts were futile. I felt like I couldn't free myself from the pain. I needed time to sort myself out, to find a way to process what had happened. One evening, sitting at the table and going through old photographs, I came across one in which Katia and I were happy. We were young, full of hope, and that moment seemed so far away. I remember how we laughed that day, how she hugged me, how I felt like our love was something that would never fade. My gaze locked onto that photo, and once again there were these thoughts that I tried to chase away. Why? Why was she cheating on me? What in our lives had led to this moment? I didn't know the answer. I was depressed and lost. My mother noticed my condition and, without waiting for me to start talking, she asked, "Don't you want to talk? I can see that you can't calm down. You're still thinking about her." I felt a wave of anger and pain rising inside me. I didn't want to talk about it, but I knew my mom had a right to know. I couldn't hide from her. "Yes, I'm thinking about her." I paused, trying to find the right words. "She betrayed me." It's not just the betrayal. It's all the devastation I can't even describe in words. My mother sat down next to me, her gaze full of sympathy. You don't have to hold it in, Sasha. You have to get over it to move on. I remembered how Katia had tried to explain her actions. She said that at some point she felt lonely. She attributed it to boredom, lack of attention, some inner turmoil she couldn't cope with. I didn't understand it. I couldn't understand how anyone could do that. We were always there for each other, supporting each other. I was her rock, and she took it all and ruined it. Mom, I interrupted my thoughts. She said she lacked attention. But is that an excuse? Is that a reason to ruin our lives? Mother was silent. She knew it was hard to find the right words at times like this. And I understood that. But inside me, everything was shattered. I didn't know how to rebuild myself after the trust had been broken. I didn't know what to do with this feeling of betrayal, this inner sense of emptiness. Those days I spent at my mother's were a time when I tried to gather my thoughts, tried to find a way to move on. I didn't know if it would work, but I felt I had to try. I started to get back to my old rhythm of life, at least partially. I went out for walks, tried to regain at least some sense of normalcy. But the same pain remained inside me. With every step I realized that something had to change, that I had to move forward. I started calling friends, re-establishing contact with people I hadn't talked to in a long time. Sometimes, when I met with them, I tried to talk about something neutral, something that didn't concern Katia's infidelity. But the conversation always came back to what had happened. I tried to ignore these topics, but it was impossible. One day, meeting Igor, I felt that I couldn't keep quiet any longer. He was one of the few people who knew the whole truth. Igor, like many of my friends, tried to support me, but I realized that it was hard for him to understand what I was going through. Sasha, you can't live in this past, he once said, sitting in a cafe. You have to move forward. Yes, it hurts. But if you hold on to it, you'll never be able to live a normal life. I didn't know what to say back. His words were true, but they couldn't make what I was going through any easier. I couldn't just forget. How could I forget the woman I had spent so many years with? How could I forget a love that had turned into betrayal in an instant? I know it's hard for you, Igor continued. But life goes on, and you have to keep going. You are stronger than you think. Igor was right. I understood that. But was I ready to start a new phase? A new step in my life? The question remained open, but I knew that in order to move forward, I needed to sort myself out. I needed to take this blow and start building my life anew, without her. I didn't know if it would work, but I knew there was no other way. My life was changing, and even though I wasn't ready for it, I couldn't change anything. Every day I spent at my mother's was like a struggle with myself. Each morning I tried to figure out how to move on with my life, but the more I thought, the clearer it became that everything I knew was shattered. I didn't know what to do with myself, how to regain my trust, how to believe that my life could ever be normal. Katia and her betrayal were everywhere, in every thought, in every memory. Despite this, I tried to pull myself together, tried to find some reference points to move on. Still, I realized that I couldn't just hide from reality. At some point I realized that it was necessary to return to my home. My mother supported me as best she could, but I knew that continuing to hide was not the answer. I needed to regain control of my life, to return to my familiar surroundings, even if it was painful. When I got home, everything around me felt foreign. Everything that reminded me of the past, every corner, every detail in the apartment, made me feel like I was living in a stranger's house. I touched things that had once belonged to us and thought they were all part of my lost life. Katia had left her things, her clothes, the little things that were so important to her. All of these things became symbols of the life we had once built together. But now, when I looked at these items, I saw them only as a reminder of betrayal. A few days passed and I couldn't find the strength to get rid of her things. I was afraid it would be too painful. But at some point I realized that holding on to it all would mean continuing to live in the past. I gathered all of her things, put them in a bag, and set them by the door. I didn't know when or how she would pick them up, but I knew it was a step toward release. The step I needed to finally leave her behind. Every morning I felt her presence in the house again, even when she wasn't around. In every shadow, in every noise, in every strange sense of emptiness, I felt that she was still around somewhere. And in those moments, a wave of anger, pain, despair would come over me again. How could I do this? How could you betray someone who was there for you, who gave you everything? There was no answer, but one day, a week after returning home, I decided to take the step I had been putting off for a long time. I decided to meet Katia. We agreed to meet at a cafe, a place that had once been special to us. It was where we had spent our first dates, it was where she had told me she loved me. I remembered her sitting across from me, her eyes shining with happiness. And now I was supposed to meet her, not knowing how to act, what to say, what to think. But I realized that if I didn't meet her, if I didn't hear her side of what was going on, I would never be able to move on. When I arrived at the cafe, Katia was already sitting at a table. She was the same as always, her beauty hadn't changed, but I could see that there was something new in her eyes. Pain, shame, maybe even fear. She looked up when she saw me, and a shadow of worry flashed across her face. "Hi," she said quietly, but her voice was restrained. She clearly didn't know how to start the conversation. "You came," I didn't know what to say in response. How do you talk to someone who betrayed you so deeply? How do you talk to someone who has ruined your life, whose face you once loved and now it seems alien and hostile? "We have to talk," I said, trying not to let my emotions show. "I need to understand what happened." Not immediately, but I began to feel like I had a chance at a new beginning. I accepted that my life was different now, that you can't just bring back the old, but you can build a new one. And it wasn't a discouraging or tragic process. It was a liberating process. I learned to forgive not for the sake of others, but for my own sake. One day, as I was sitting in a cafe enjoying a cup of coffee, a woman approached me. Her face was new and unfamiliar, but she smiled in a way that I couldn't help but notice how her eyes sparkled with kindness and lightness. We got to talking, and I felt like this meeting, though casual, gave me something new, hope. We agreed to meet again, and although I couldn't say in advance what would come of it, I realized that I was ready to give myself and the new relationship a chance. It was still a while before I could open up to someone again. But once I did, I realized that letting go of the past and forgiving was not the end, but a fresh start. I was ready for a new relationship because I was no longer living in the shadow of what I had lost. I learned to appreciate the present instead of getting stuck in self-pity. The journey was long, full of pain and doubt, but I realized that every step along the way was necessary. I became stronger, more mature, learned to be at peace with myself. And perhaps that was the best outcome of this whole tragedy, learning to love myself and move forward despite everything that had once broken me. I never looked back again. There were many uncharted roads ahead, and I knew that I was now ready to walk them.